Кнопку. А, вот, зеленая тут работает. Бурбуль. Так, а тут будет все подключено тоже, да? Можно сидеть же? Хотя я, может быть, встану. Я, может быть, встану. Не знаю, как мне.
Женебек будет сидеть с вами здесь?
А я там глянуть хочу, я не буду такого.
Тогда он уже быстрее.
Я вот так встану там.
На свой этаж скинь. Так, окей. А что там останется? Это смотри.
Или вот так стану, да. Я вот так буду, да, точно.
Или может сейчас высмотреть?
Спрячусь как раз.
Там остановить статус организатора или остаться организатором? С орган.
Кто-то онлайн есть?
Пока нет.
Или ее не объявляли онлайн?
В половину все верно. Еще 10 минут?
Мне надо... У нас целый час, да?
У вас всё.
Я надеюсь, не буду так минут 20 справиться. Видео не будет? Надеюсь. У меня? Здесь? Да, да. Так, а вот это спрятать можно?
Микро работает. Хорошо.
Работал же только что. Он уже подключен к экрану. Ну, вот к этому. А то я хотел покрутить, чтобы все видели.
Она подключена уже, да.
Нормально. Всё уже.
Новая техника.
Нет, все поздно. Сейчас начну повторять при людях.
Точно уже. Какой вам удобно пользоваться? Такой есть, такой есть.
Как назад? А, вот это. Я думал, вот это стрелка вперед, а вот это назад. А это
Нет.
просто стерлось. Это.
Да.
У меня там также было. Я думаю, я нажимаю вот в одну сторону. Я думал, это вверх, а это назад.
Вот этот шорт-файл.
5 минут. Хорошо.
Что 20 минут прошло, и потом 30 минут.
Хорошо.
Если я не
Просто.
Или что я могу увлечься.
Все, хорошо, понял. Let's just wait for a couple of minutes and then we get started. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you again for joining us in the last panel. So this panel, we will have with us Dr. Kuat Akizhanov to present his newly published book on inequality and political economy. So we're going to have about 1 hour, 30-40 minutes presentation, followed by 20 minutes Q&A. So just keep your questions till the end if you have any questions. So let me introduce you, Dr. Kuat Akizhanov. Dr. Kuat Akizhanov is Associate Professor at the Kazgu University School of Economics. He holds a PhD degree in political economy from Bath University in the UK. And his mainly research interest is in financialization, finance capitalism, neoliberalism, Eurasia, with a focus on Eurasian region. So basically, we'll be in this session, we'll be mostly talking about political economy and mostly about inequality issues. So the book is titled Finance Capitalism and Income Inequality. You see it here in the contemporary global economy. So comparative comparative study of the US, South Korea, Argentina, and Sweden. The book was out with Palgrave Macmillan earlier this year. So you can have a look. I mean, if it's in your interest, have a look. You'll find the electronic version as well as the hard copy on the website. So yeah, so again, 40 minutes for presentation and plus 20-25 minutes Q&A. Without further ado, I would like to give the stage to Dr. Akizhanov. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenibek, for kind invitation. And thank you for those of you who came here. I know that this is the last session. So I will try to keep it to 25-30 minutes, but please warn me when 20 minutes is over, because usually with speakers, it's always. Okay, so as Jenibek said, this is the presentation is based on my book. I will try to connect it to the current situation, to the current situation in Kazakhstan. And this is mostly, the book is about inequality, but in the context of finance capitalism. And in the book, in my monograph, I developed this so-called financialization-induced income inequality. Financialization. Do you hear me? Okay, financialization-induced income inequality. And I will try, which is not covered in the book, but try to connect some ideas of the book, because it was mostly about these 4 countries, not about Kazakhstan, but to the current situation in Kazakhstan. So why inequality important? Obviously, for the last 20 to 30 years, there's been an idea that the complaints from us, mostly heterodox economists, that the issue of wealth and income inequality is ignored. But the data shows that it's a very urgent issue, both for low income, middle income, and rich countries. You can see some numbers how the inequality is skyrocketed in so many societies. And just the last number in 2021, it shows that less than 300 people possess more wealth than 1 billion of all women and girls in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean combined. Of course, this is not only cultural or social issue. This is more issue of the social economic structure, which we enjoy now globally, so to speak. This is a very quick overview. So if you can see, all data is used for the period of 1980 to 2010. And just to remind you, Gini coefficient runs from 0 to 1, where 0 means total equality, which is impossible, or 1 means that one person possesses all the wealth. So basically, the trend is that from 1980s onward, and 1980s is taken as the beginning of the dominance of the so-called neoliberal way of governance, both in mostly in socioeconomic governance. And in countries as different as USA, South Korea, I didn't have data from, but after the South Korea restructured its economy, its famous so-called developmentalist model into more Anglo-Saxon way of capitalism, you can see how it's skyrocketed, and that's also coincided with the Asian financial crisis in 1997. We can see Argentina is a classical case where there is not just a lost decade, but maybe a quarter of century of lost of rising income inequality. And by the way, some experts believe that if inequality, a Gini coefficient extends, is higher than 0.45 and is approaching, 50%, it means that the society is in huge conflict, is almost on the edge of, some kind of conflict. And this is what we have been observing in so many countries. Sweden is an exception in my case, which proves the exception. So I have a separate chapter for each book where I show that in Sweden, they manage more or less to resist this counter neoliberal revolution. But even in Sweden, when for the first time in their 50 years of political history, when the Conservative Party came to power, they tried to flirt a little bit and played with some kind of pro-market restructuring, and then immediately they got this, huge rocket in income inequality. Also, after the so-called FIRE sector, finance, insurance, real estate sector was over booming, and so this party lost next elections, and they returned to their classical Scandinavian type of governance, more or less. Okay, so but anyway, even it's on the rise, it never exceeded the 30% of inequality. This is the United Kingdom, also kind of classical case, because according to some narrative, the neoliberal revolution started with the so-called politically, the so-called the rise of the rights of Miss Thatcher coming to power, but it was actually a little bit earlier, even with the Callaghan's Labour Party, and with Reagan coming to power in the United States. So you can see how United Kingdom is actually one of the most unequal societies in the Western world, especially in Europe. Okay. Kazakhstan, I couldn't find the data for my own curiosity, but surprisingly, there was some number. And in 1996, it was more than 50%. Yeah. Now there is no valid data. I'm working, to find out. But we can see that there is some evidence how the income inequality is a huge issue for countries as different as United States and Kazakhstan, Canada and Kyrgyzstan, Germany and Argentina, for example. Most experts believe that the January 2022 events were the classical example of a very kind of class approach to the problem. Of course, there have been many factors, other factors like succession of power, but still it mostly because the level of wealth and income inequality is skyrocketing in our country. A little bit of epistemological stance. One of my claims in the book is that we believe that as heterodox economists, we believe that the social reality should be considered from the open system vantage point, which is one of the bases of the philosophy of critical realism. This is a Cambridge School of Economics, which criticizes the approach of mainstream economics. And by the way, the later was one of the reasons why inequality to some extent was ignored on the political spectrum, because there have been for a long time kind of scientific justification and legitimization provided by mainstream school based on the neoclassical ideas that inequality is almost okay. It's almost good. Okay, so that's why in my I approached my hypothesis of the financialization-induced income inequality from the critical realist point of view, and I had to employ pluralist, very different schools like neo-Marxism, neo-institutionalism, and post-Keynesianism, and each school would provide me with the necessary tools to reveal this nexus of financialization and income inequality. So very quickly, yeah, I basically in my research in the book, I described how the income in the financial sector, both income and rental income is skyrocketing, whereas the income of labor is declining in different societies, especially for the last 50 to 40 years. Okay. And then I compare it and to show and how it is interconnected actually with financialization. What is the financialization after all? I will start with, there is a classical now definition provided by Epstein, which means that, financialization is the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of the domestic and international economies. So financialization basically means the dominance of finance in all spectrum, in all dimensions of the society, okay? Not necessarily political and economic, but even in social one, as a precondition for the financialization to happen, and that's what my claim in the book is that, financialization is the outcome of the neoliberal revolution, neoliberal restructuring of local economies, national economies, which started in the late 1970s, 1980s in many economies. To be short, this type of capitalism by 1990s and 2000s, we have a lot of similarities of capitalism, which advanced capitalist economies enjoyed at the end of 19th century, or even in the pre-war period, okay, with the so-called gilded era of capitalism, okay, with very high inequality and, very basically approved laissez-faire policies, austerity measures, so to speak. Next 50 years, there was, after the World War II, there was the time of the Bretton Woods institutions, and this period is justly called golden era of capitalism, when the atrocities of capitalism were more or less tamed and framed in them with the help of the creation of the welfare state in the advanced capitalist countries and some socialist and progressive reforms in developing countries. Okay. So, as I said, neoliberal restructuring is a precondition for the financialization of the economy to happen. And the main implications, as I said, the neoliberal ideology became dominant and hegemonic in the country. But once established, it becomes a very convenient mode of economic and political governance for the ruling classes, mostly for the finance rentiers and those who are in power, to the way to accumulate capital in the most efficient way. Okay. And once this mode of governance is established, it naturally leads to rising income inequality. So what are those preconditions, okay, or stages? First of all, there is a classical crisis of capital accumulation, and which has been observed by experts in 1970s, 1980s, when the ruling class, for the first time in human history, probably in many advanced economies and developing economies, the share of public income, public wealth was more or less equally redistributed. Okay, which means that at least the 1% or 5% of the high income earners didn't control the wealth of the country to the extent it used to be till 1920s somewhere in the United States, when 1% would control up to 30 to 40% of the whole wealth. Whereas by 1970s, it became like less than 10%. Okay, and so so the ruling classes, again, if we borrow from Marxist geographers like David Harvey, they argue that there is a neoliberalism should be considered as a class project to help the ruling classes turn towards finance capitalism, so that to replace the old form of capitalist mode of production represented by Fordism and Keynesian demand management. Okay, and most importantly for the capital class, and that's what I focus in first chapters, that there was a mobilization of the transnational capitalist class to free finance, literally. Okay, and to remind you, during after the World War II till 1980s, till 1970s, because of the Bretton Woods institutions, there was a huge, very strict control of the transnational capital. Okay, there was no free movement of capital. Okay. Okay. So as I mentioned, this interest of the ruling classes has to be mobilized. Okay, and at the same very time, I will not repeat the whole history, but basically by 1970s, 1980s, this epistemological shift has happened when, in 1970s, people like Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises were awarded Nobel Prize in economics. They were comparatively marginalized economists and political scientists back in 1950s, 1960s. Their books were not that popular ideas. By 1970s, 1980s, it was a completely reverse of ideas. This kind of pro-market ideas became so popular, and many of them became, kind of in the curriculums of the universities, the public choice theory, human capital theory. As I said, many universities by that time adopted approach to teaching economics as a neoclassical economics, which abuses the formalistic mathematical deductivism in economics. Okay. So in my cases, in my country cases, like USA, Korea, Argentina, there was some unique. In every country, there would be some unique political situations. Okay, how to mobilize the local comprador or capitalist class. Okay, but as I said, most importantly, it was to make sure that there would be ideational shift in ideas. Okay, and then some political events, that in the West, 1970s are characterized by the so-called stagflation, when the old mode of governance, the Keynesian demand management, couldn't now address the issues of stagflation. And so it was presented as, because of the problem of the big state, of the welfare state, business classes always, kind of manipulated with this idea of sage mentalities, that they had to do something to save the country. In Argentina, there was an issue from 1970s, like in Kazakhstan or in Russia and many other kinds of issue with hyperinflation, which has to be tamed. In Korea, after the collapse of the authoritarian state, which was associated with developmentalist model, and which managed actually to make country to bring country from literally from the third world to the first world. But that developmentalist state was associated with authoritarian regime, and the whole idea was to abandon this authoritarian regime and to keep up with globalization, which at that time in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was associated with globalization and neoliberal restructuring. In Sweden, there was also voices about being able to sustain competitiveness, whether the country is able to support its welfare state, very generous one. Okay. Okay, and of course, new ideas such as competitiveness, creditworthiness, consumption as a human right, public choice, and many other ideas and euphemisms began to reign the public sphere. And most of them would legitimize new ideas of austerity measures, of independent central banks, which now is taken for granted. But if you ask students from economic school, they would be very surprised if you ask this question. They have no doubt that central banks are here to fight inflation and not to actually to protect the interest of financial rentiers. Okay, of course. There's a lot of attention to the so-called transnational capitalist class. This neoliberal counter-revolution wouldn't happen without unification, okay, both from inside and from outside, okay? So in every country it's different, but basically because of some geoeconomic reasons we don't have time to discuss, most international political economists believe that by 1970s, the so-called Wall Street Federal Reserve IMF complex was strong enough, and where Wall Street would represent the financial interest of the bankers, of the most powerful bankers in the US. Federal Reserve would represent the interest of United States as a geopolitical power, and IMF would be transformed completely by 1980s, shifting those ideas of, more pro-market approach. And by that time, many countries already enjoyed, in Africa and Latin America in 1980s, they enjoyed those, so to speak, those pro-market and market fundamentalism, in the words of Stiglitz, Professor Stiglitz, reforming. So when it came to our countries, to the Eurasian region, many post-Soviet, post-socialist countries, so it was already now kind of something usual to do by IMF and by the World Bank. But in many countries, on the global level, many powerful organizations such as OECD, EU, IMF, they all adopt those new rules. Okay. So basically, I build my argument further, showing that financialization becomes a generative mechanism of increasing income inequality. Okay, and this happens once the ruling classes, okay, who would support basically, in most of the cases, the financial rentiers, will adapt after neoliberal restructuring, after pro-market reforms, new rules, new type of capitalism. Some call it Anglo-Saxon, but which is not necessarily the case. New types of the so-called shareholder capitalism, for example, okay, which for many corporations now is completely different than it used to be in the 1960s or 1970s, when they would focus more on production, not on the current value of the market value of their company, okay? So at the same time, the pressure of financialization now became natural for many governments, and they would they would address any problems of 1990s and 2000s by the same token as they used to do, but by cutting social spending, okay, to keep up with creditworthiness, or in order to sustain with competitiveness and foreign investment attractiveness, they will downsize the labor force. Or in the United States, one of the hypotheses says that the reason, the core problems of the 2007 financial crisis is that, first of all, because the population was highly indebted. It was highly indebted because for the 30, 40 years, the income of the middle class, the middle class was stagnating. But in parallel, for 30 years, there was so-called financial innovation, which I consider as a complete oxymoron. When you see these phrases, financial innovations is mostly about, creating new speculative forms of, how to finance. And CDOs, this collateral damage obligations, this is just an example. They were called by Buffett, the investor, as a weapon of mass destruction. Okay, and that's kind of policies like in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world. The idea to sustain or to reach the so-called American dream, to make every family to buy households. In the situation when there was no income, it was all about having more access to credits. Okay, and that's how the household indebtedness just skyrocketed from 1990s. So in many cases, in US and Kazakhstan are very similar here. The wealth of the 1990s, the booming economies of 1990s and 2000s here was in many cases illusionary. Okay, so what this mechanism means basically, after the financial liberalization and deregulation, those new ways of extracting income from the population, from the economy, became, a new mode, a new status quo. a lot of financial organizations, instruments are now invented. In Kazakhstan, we have been very proud and boasted that, you know, Kazakh banking system is the most kind of developed. Yeah, but it was mostly about, you know, creating more financial centers, and for banks, national banks taking advantage out of the high ratings of the country, okay, and borrowing cheap money and bringing them to the population, which still had this structural problem of very low incomes. Okay, and so when you have low income, you have this access to the credits. Okay, and that's how it creates very unsustainable, illusionary perception that you are rich. Okay, okay. This mechanism enables financial rent seeking and a replacement of welfare institutions by regressive redistributional policies. And at the end, what we have, we are left with increased rental income from financial assets and augmented debt. Yeah, so all data shows that in countries as different than Kazakhstan and the United States, the financial rentiers' income is just skyrocketed. Okay, and just to remind you, rent was considered as a quasi-parasitic income from the very classical economists, from Ricardo time, from Adam Smith. Any kind of rent is, if not parasitic, but at least pseudo-parasitic income, okay, which is not about creating sustainable economy. Okay, we're almost at the end, right? Yeah, I know. How much time is passed? How much time passed? Wow, okay, 20. Okay, so going back closer to our case, to Kazakhstan, where we're now, we have to admit, first of all, that Kazakhstan is a highly unequal country. It's been admitted, begin from Kantar time by President Tokayev, and I have to, as someone who following the news for the last 20 years, I have to admit that that was for the first time. Okay, so Kazakhstan would follow this usual neoliberal narrative on the global level, saying that yes, there is a problem with poverty, but we're fighting it, and never would admit, because it wasn't even on the academic level, saying that one of the reasons for poverty is inequality. Okay? Inequality is not the consequence of poverty; it's vice versa. Inequality is the cause of poverty. Okay, so we have this data very well known. In my today's presentation this morning, I showed another one showing that, you know, almost 8 million Kazakh families, people in Kazakhstan, in a country of 20 million, has to some extent some debt. Okay, so I mean, this is unbelievable. It means that almost every household has kind of debt, and this debt is not, you know, the main reason is because people have to make their ends meet. Okay. In Kazakhstan, I tried to extrapolate, of course, to find out what I revealed in American case or in Swedish case or in South Korean. There are a lot of similarities, but in Kazakhstan, what is interesting, how the neoliberal restructuring has happened and why. First of all, we have to admit that neoliberal ideology is very politically it's capable of grabbing the political momentum. Okay, it's very flexible. You would never meet anybody saying I'm neoliberal. In most of the cases, we say I believe in market economy. Okay, so they don't believe that there is some kind of ideology called neoliberalism, and this is another translation of how neoliberal ideology is very easily adopted because of depolitization. Okay, once you say, "Oh, come on, this is not about politics. This is pure economics." Okay, this is about governance. This is about being effective, and this is what President Nazarbayev in his very first book wrote. Yeah, it's very difficult to find, but it's online. It is called without the rights and the left, без правых и левых. So the message was that, look, we're not playing politics. I'm just a guy, you know, who knows how to fix the economy. But once you depoliticize the narrative, it's very easy actually to impose, you know, those policies you actually want to. Okay, this depolitization and de-idealization, and remember, in many countries, right after the collapse of Soviet Union, democratization was associated with idealization. You know, people would be scared of ideology. The common sense was, look, enough of ideology. All we need is to to do something like the whole world is doing. Okay, so there was no differentiation of what kind of capitalism. There was no understanding or little discussion, if any, that Scandinavian capitalism is different from British, or European capitalism is different from American, and so on. Okay, and that would help to undertake very drastic adjustment programs, market-oriented reforms, help for the dominance of the market, free market ideas. Okay, as I'm saying in my other presentations, Kazakhstan is famous actually in promoting, in restructuring its economy very radically. Okay, we joined WTO. Even much earlier, we had opened our barriers for the free market. Our tax system is still flat for more than 20 years. Okay, in a country where there were socialist ideas, which is very weird. Many other examples, such as not questioning why central bank has to be independent, and many other things, and not questioning any austerity measures once there's a crisis in the country. Okay, but in my today's presentation, I was asking whether Kazakh technocratic class is able to create just Kazakhstan, or here in Kazakhstan, right? A new notions pronounced by President Tokayev. And my claim is that no, it's not possible, because there's a constant reproduction, using the words of Gramsci, Marxist Italian Gramsci, a constant reproduction of the same class, of the same ideas. And we have people almost acting like useful idiots. They never question those ideas, not because they kind of believe in the ideological, no, they just believe that this is a common sense. Okay, and I kind of engaged with articles with Mr. Irgaliyev, who's the head of Agency for Strategic Planning. Okay, this is allegedly the agency which is supposed to provide economic policy. Okay, and it's been here for 2 years now, and President Tokayev has been talking about new economic policy, NEP, okay, for 2 years, but I don't see any evidence that traces that the new economic policy. When I read his article, he was saying that we need to return to the basics, and those basics were again about competitiveness, about human capital, about investing, in free trade, in competitiveness. And so when you read and ask him, it looks like the ideas like competitiveness and free market are here just for the sake of competitiveness. They don't understand what are the goals. Okay, why we need to compete, or why we need free trade, or why we need to implement those austerity measures. Sometimes they're just here just for the sake of them. Okay. I don't know if we have time. This kind of anecdotal situation I adopted from one of the books, how the very, idea of shifting epistemological ground is impossible. Okay, because this is Mr. Kelimbetov, who is associated kind of one of the leaders who has been here for 20 years, and implementing those reforms. So when you try to persuade him that this is not a yellow butterfly from Brazil, okay, that this is just a potato chip, even if he agrees, he would say that this is a potato chip from Brazil. Okay, so this is an example to show how it's very difficult actually to. It's not like our technocratic class is very ideological and they're like really protecting, comprador class. And when you talk to them, they also believe in demonopolization, deoligarchization. They need about more openness and all these good things. But on the epistemological level, they do not understand where the politics here, okay, and the issues in many, let's say in economic governance at least. So, and this is because this reproduction of the national comprador class is going on. It's supported by transnational ideas, transnational capitalist class. And as an example, there is no question that income inequality is really high, but what is the main reasons for this income inequality? Okay, is it because like more human capital, or is it because people don't speak English, or all this, fabulous ideas how you can increase your income. No, but this, first of all, this is a structural problem, okay? This is because of what kind of capitalist economy we have built. And in our case, I claim that we have all the traces of very much financialization of the economy or finance capitalism. And, one of the examples, unfortunately, I didn't highlight it, but you can see this is an extract from the Constitution. And I remember when this amendment was made, I was surprised by the level of passivity of the society, okay? There was no any kind of discussions that, the Constitution is changed. And just because of a very small amendment, just to make sure that the Article 3.1, you see there was an amendment within the city of Nur Sultan, a special legal regime in the financial sphere may be established in accordance with constitutional law. So they amended the whole constitution just to make sure that we will have this the extraterritorial territory, called financial center. And financial center in the modern economies for the last 20 years is a huge sign of that the country is manifesting itself as being very much, financialization economy. I mean, there's very little information about, it deserves maybe someone would do that, the whole investigation, what this financial center doing, what its outcomes. I do know that it's subsidized from the budget. I do know that it does reap income, at least for its for financial rentiers, but there's very little information, and yet it enjoys an enormous benefits, being located in the extraterritorial, having extraterritorial status. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for coming again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interesting talk about the book. And indeed, inequality has become one of the main kind of depressing issues in society in Kazakhstan. And then you seem to argue that the reason behind inequality is structural, not just kind of the poor mismanagement or poor administrative connection, but structural problems or even ideological problems behind the inequality. And maybe after reading the book, some of us will reconsider our perceptions of Kaspi Bank, who knows? Yeah, with this note, I would like to open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hands. We have about 20 minutes for the Q&A. And I think we do have the microphones in the hall. Yeah, Professor Nanovsky, I was expecting you to ask the first question. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. I actually, I enjoyed the presentation. And I think your point was that it is this financialization that's bringing this inequality to happen, or that's what I understood in the end. There's a lot of talk that financialization is very good for the economy and economic growth in general. Perhaps it does put some inequality, but it's good for the economy as well, right? And also, have you considered another reason that I've heard about inequality, at least, is about the taxes, actually. And it's a tax issue. And when the taxes were lowered in the Reagan days, in the 80s, is when the first taxes were lowered from a top bracket of 70%, I think, to 35 or 40% or something along those lines. And that happened in the 80s. And it's actually a tax issue that's creating the inequality. It's not maybe a financial issue, perhaps.
Thank you very much for brilliant comments and questions. Actually, it kind of embraces many aspects. So first of all, as I mentioned, I didn't want to highlight it, but the financialization is a comparatively new phenomenon, okay, and it's invention of the heterodox economists. The orthodox economists, they don't even believe in it. They're now borrowing this, but before that, at least 10 to 20 years ago, they would never use it. They would say financial deepening. So when you're saying, development of finance is good, that's what they mean, not financialization. Financialization, as in this classical definition, is all about of creating finance capitalism, where basically in a short, all rent and income is created by taking advantage of the other sectors of the economy, okay? And up to the, as Professor Lapovista says, up to the level when these income of middle classes and labor classes is extrapolated, okay, through debt mechanisms. Another point, taxes, right? Again, we shouldn't consider this phenomenon of financialization or neoliberalism just with one instrument or one dimension. It's the whole sphere of dimension. So when Reagan came to power, of course, they never used these words of, you know, I'm neoliberal. They would say very simple message, you know, it's all about big state, you know, and his famous, the rising wave lifts all boats, okay? So when the economy is growing, everybody's happy, okay? Which after 30 years and after Reaganomics showed absolute different results. That, you know, your economy may grow like 5% a year in developed countries, or 15 like in Turkmenistan, and I'm not questioning that. But not necessarily all boats will be lifted. It's all about redistribution. And taxation is one of the way of it. So yeah, you're right that taxation is one of the issue, and that's what financialization is doing. Not financial dependence, but financialization. They would create a political context where, you know, almost all politicians will not question that it's an issue of inflation and that you have to lower taxes because people love it. But that's how eventually from 1970s, we now came to another phenomenon described by Professor Uri in a beautiful book, Offshoring. So he claims that the amount of assets, financial assets, okay, in the offshores now equals to the amount of, if we used all this amount in the offshores, we could eradicate global poverty 3 times. Can you imagine? And this is all connected to this taxation issue, how the ruling classes first argued that, claimed that, you know, lower taxes would reinvigorate the economy. And then it was, you know, every time they would ask for more and more and demand for more. And then there was a mobility of capital and then the offshores. In 1970s, there were like just 5 or 6 offshore zones. Now there are 50 or 60. Almost every country wants to have some kind of offshore zone. So the amount of asset accumulated there, as I said, is enormous. And from the very first classical economists, they already described that this amount of capital, it can be used on like a rent. And this is a very parasitic rent. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
By the way, we have this issue in this country, okay? There's a whole program of returning the asset to country. And where this asset is in offshores, okay? And it was possible after this so-called financial deepening happened, or what I call financialization.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you for your talk. I have a question around the IMF and the WTO. Like when Kazakhstan became independent and also other post-Soviet countries, as far as I understand, they needed resources, and so they wanted to get money from the IMF, but then they had to fulfill a specific specific financial or economic goals. And I was wondering how much, I mean, I see that somehow connected, this whole financialization. And then I wanted to ask about that. How much would you say they were pushed towards fulfilling these economic goals because they didn't have any other options to get their projects financed? And then the second question was, I know that there's a whole conversation about the IMF and global financial capitalism being a new form of colonialism in a way, and a form of like cultural colonialism. And I was wondering what you would say about that.
Okay, thank you. Another very good question. and most of the research now also has shown that IMF by 1980s, unfortunately, turned into a very powerful organization which have this neoliberal agenda, and that hadn't been the case all the time. IMF was a production of the Bretton Woods institutions, and 1950s, 1960s, it did help a lot. But the problem, once they changed these articles, their political agenda, they would provide the loans in exchange for the so-called structural adjustment programs. And that was all tested in African and Latin American countries in the 1980s. And then after 1991, in the post-Soviet era, in post-socialist countries, when IMF became highly politicized, promoting this kind of more pro-market reforming of the economies, okay? And that one of the reasons why on the radical left, organizations such as World Bank and IMF are considered almost like an evil organizations, even though their chapter, their mission is, without question, is to help countries. But unfortunately, with this kind of neoliberal agenda, a lot of economists, not necessarily radical Marxist, but economists very much mainstream one, like Krugman and Stiglitz, they have shown how the outcomes of those reforms in many countries were very negative, okay? And so, yes, IMF to some extent was one of those promoters of those neoliberal ideas, and in reproducing, I would say, this epistemological approach that how the economy or society should be governed. I myself even have some examples. Like I used to work for the government in the Ministry of Finance. So I managed to spend some time in the very nice, very popular summer schools, the Vienna Summer School. IMF has its school in Singapore and in Vienna. So as a trained economist, I mean, I had my master's degree at that time, but I could see how I was there for 3 times, how even the curriculum for their public servants from Ministry of Finance or national banks, it was all the same, you know. There was no any questioning of, you know, issues of whether it should be that way. It was very much kind of particular agenda all the time for the last 30 years, you know, how the, you know, what is the role of the Minister of Finance or central banks. So I'm not sure if, what was the second part question? Is this?
I think it was the question about whether that whole process of financialization can be described or could be described as something like a new form of colonialism.
Okay.
Which I have heard that argument being made as a form of cultural colonialism.
Again, I would take a precaution, you know, because once you begin to criticize and to talk about financialization, neoliberal destruction, there will be voices about accusing you in conspiracy theories. No, there is no conspiracy, okay? And, you know, those who talk about conspiracy, usually we talk about conspiracy when we can't explain something. So we are giving facts here, okay? So to many heterodox economists, financialization or neoliberal destruction is not something which had been planned somewhere in the so-called Washington Consensus agenda. No, it happened to some extent naturally, but we need to remember the radical political economy, Marxist economy, and a lot of works by Gramsci who would say how this ideational change, how the ideas and ideologies always, the ruling ideologies always represents the interests of the ruling class, okay? So at some point, what happened in countries like Kazakhstan or Russia is that those ideas coincided. After 1991, the ruling class, all of a suddenly, on the picture, there was a guy, right, about depolitization, how actually their interests coincided with the political agenda of those organizations, okay? How they all of a sudden realized that how the privatization and liberalization and deregulation of financial markets would actually enrich them, okay? Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 more questions. Professor Clifford, please.
None? Okay. Thank you so much. Super interesting. I find myself sitting here kind of channeling what might be some arguments of neoliberal ideologists who either read about or know. I mean, not my own philosophies, but two things. Well, maybe three things. How would you respond? You know, the neoliberal says, okay, we'll grant you that the debt crisis was a problem, and that and that people were going into debt, and so we'll fix that problem by regulating the financial market more, the banks more, et cetera, and so to mitigate that from being as bad again as it was leading into 2008. But then they might say there are two things that would defend this system. One is that under global trade and neoliberalism, it brings prices way down for even the poor in the society. And we hear this argument being made in the United States by Walmart, actually, where Walmart says, look, we're bringing the cost of shoes down, and the cost of toys, et cetera, so that people can buy them. And then they might also say the welfare state and in the golden age, when you talk about kind of taking the worst out of the kind of taming capitalism, and now the welfare state is being weakened. But what about essentially the private provision of welfare, right? Through nonprofits, through civil society, right? And so this voluntary sector should be able to somehow substitute for state capitalism. And how would your work be able to respond to those two defenses that neoliberals might make?
Okay, thank you. It's pretty much a broad question, so maybe my answer, I will try to do it not that vague. Well, basically, again, the difference between, some philosophers of social science said, the difference between Keynes and Marx is that Marx kind of, if we can, of course, say instead of him, for him, he was arguing, claiming to destroy capitalism, okay? He has this idealistic idea of socialist or even communist society. Keynes wanted and succeeded in restructuring capitalism because he lived in the time when he witnessed it, literally this kind of golden era of capitalism, 5 years old people or children working in coal mines and all these atrocities of capitalism. So he succeeded, and that's why there's a big difference between the gilded era of capitalism, named by Mark Twain in the 19th century, when 1% enjoyed all the wealth of Belle Epoque, and golden era of capitalism. So the gilded era would say that this is not good, okay? It's just, very unequal, it's unjust. And then we have had, or at least capitalist countries had the golden age capitalism, and there is no irony there. It was for the first time probably in human history when the capitalist system has been more progressive in the 19th century was more or less tamed, okay, and put into the under the kind of regulatory mechanisms of the Keynesian demand management. And that was the time when the countries managed to create what we now take for granted, at least your generation or former generation, as a welfare state, both in developed and developing countries, more or less, welfare state. Now, when neoliberal says that, it's all about market economy, it's about being more efficient, it's about cheap products. Yes, to some extent true, but again, we don't have much time to argue. But first of all, this way of structuring market economy or unleashing, all these unregulated forces of market economy, they lead even deeper structural problems, such as in case of free trade, to not necessarily to cheap products. Yes, cheap products. I remember in 1990s in this country we enjoyed now for the first time probably in our life 20 types of cheeses instead just of 2. Of course, it's good for me personally as a consumer, but at the same time, this unregulated free trade led to deindustrialization of the economies. Okay, and then again, fortunately, we have now these books published by Stiglitz and Ha-Chung Chang, who shows that, well, you know what, there is nothing new about it. That how actually in 18th, 19th century, the so-called developed economies were created in UK, in Germany, in France. You know, they had very high tariffs, up to 50%. Okay, I always bring this example to my students in the history of economic thought. That the first president of the United States, Washington, you know, before the revolution, in order to buy a new suit, he had to make some measures and write a letter, and from the US, right, to send all these measures to, what's this guy? Taylor, to Great Britain, and wait for 3 months for this suit. Why? Because the emperor, the metropole, would prohibit for the local territories to have any industries, okay? So he had to wait for this, not because he was not, you know, it's a huge territory where it was. And that's how it works, unfortunately. So yes, I do agree that there is this form of, answering the previous question, there is a form of neocolonialism. Yeah, there is a free trade, you know, you would enjoy cheap products. And that's how Americans now, you know, as some populists maybe, or maybe heterodox economists say, look, we, for 20, 30 years, you enjoyed cheap products. But at the same time, you reindustrialize your economy. We have this, what is called? Rжавый пояс.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I just
sorry.
have two questions. I think I see.
Sorry if I...
Can I ask you the question?
Thank you. Interesting and timely. I certainly enjoyed it. This inequality, of course, is a global phenomenon now under neoliberalism, and you have presented 4 cases. I'm keen to know about the Kazakhstan case, although you said that you don't have the data to show the trend or whether this is increasing or not. My question is, in similar kinds of situations, normally what we have, talking about taxation, is progressive tax system. But I understand that what we have here is a proportional tax. Everybody pays 10% flat, 10% of your income. So if that is the case, then how is it going to address the inequality? I mean, those who earn more, they are still contributing only 10%. The other issue is whether you have any wealth tax and how much the rich are actually paying in the form of taxes. If that is not addressed, then again, the inequality is going to get worse rather than kind of being addressed. So is there any mechanism in place to address this? That's my question. Thank you.
Very good.
That was the same question almost, but anyway, just want to know, maybe it's a different way, but my question is quite different. Let's say that we talk about here income and inequality, right? And speak about the Kazakhstan exactly. What do you think? Is there any mercantilism? And, you know, there's a government's much powerful or independent. Nobody can say this, we are independent or dependent, right? But if much powerful countries like Russia, China, or someone else can have their own game, and that might be, I don't know, can impact on income and inequality. Is that possible? Is that written in your book?
I'm not sure I understand the second one, so but I will start with it. Unfortunately, there's also geopolitical, geoeconomic situations, and like small countries literally are not able. I always say we're unhappy that, you know, we became independent when these Bretton Woods institutions collapsed. Okay, we live in a post-Bretton Woods institutions of a complete freedom of movement, and it's normal. If you want to be a normal country, you have to liberalize. Okay, you have to. Otherwise, you will be labeled as a, you know, Cuban economy or Venezuela or something. Okay, this is first. Second, the first question concerning taxation. Well, your question is the evidence of to what extent the neoliberal thinking is embedded in the very fabric of this society and economic governance. President Tokayev raised that issue for the first time 2 years ago, and for the first time in 20 years, that we have a flat system, which, by the way, to remind you, 30 years ago was introduced as something like, it's just, it's unjust for people to pay different level of taxes. Okay, now it's understand that, the welfare state has been created in developed countries with the progressive taxation. And yet, for the last 2 years, there's only talks. They always have reasons to postpone it. This is an example how it's deeply into. It's comparatively easy in country like Kazakhstan, which have very strong executive power, to enact the law. Okay, and it's not moving. Again, there were some talks that maybe we should introduce a luxury tax. In a country where there's so many expensive cars and huge houses, we still don't have luxury tax or wealth tax or heritage tax. So this is an example actually how this neoliberal way of governance is embedded deeply, okay, in the society.
Great, thank you very much, and congratulations again on your book, and thank you for the audience for your participation and questions. Now I'd like to invite here Professor Ricardo Pilidze for the closing remarks. Am I correct? Yeah.
Well, we survived even this year. We had a very long and rich program. We had 6 panels, a book launch, a lot of speakers from all over the world. We had speakers from United States, United Kingdom, Spain, a lot of the British speaker from Britain. I don't see him, but I know it's around here. And we had a program rich in terms of presenters, in terms of presentation, in terms of content. We dealt with the open government, local governments, government effectiveness, migration, identity policy, and so on and so on. We really talked about many of the topics that are at the core of the core interest of the courses that we teach in our program. So, I think even this year, it's very clear that the kind of teaching that we do is very much aligned with the research that we do, and also that our friends, our colleagues around the world are doing. So, which means that we are very much aligned with the, forgive me for using this expression, slightly post-colonial or neo-colonial or whatever that is, best practices. It was great to see you, and we hope that, next year we're going to come up with an equally successful conference. The conference is not entirely successful thanks to the efforts of the great organizing committee chair, which is me, but it's also, and most importantly, successful because you participate, you come up with good papers, you come up with good ideas, you come up with good analysis, you come up with the insight into problems and issues that really are important to us that studying political science, economics, public policy, public administration. And so I hope that next year we can come up with an equally successful topic, with an equally successful program, with a nice team and another exceptionally good keynote speaker, so that, will remain relevant for a while longer. And on these happy notes, thank you to the book presenter. Thank you, all of you. It was great to see you, and see you in, oh, no, I'm lying. Sorry. Beginning of Alzheimer, probably. What I wanted to say is that next year, we're not going to hold the conference in May, at the end of the semester. We're going to have it in October, which is the way in which we started the conference in 2016. We think that that's going to be much better because right now, several of our students, the semester is finished, are not around and cannot enjoy this presentation. And actually, it's beneficial for us to attend the various panels and hear to what the presenters have to say. But I think that this presentation will be even more important, more useful to inform what our students do, and it will enrich their learning experience. So it would be really great for us to have the conference in October when they can attend. And so we are going to have a much more participation, more questions, and it will be also pedagogically more useful. I think on this note, if I have not forgotten something else, oh, sorry, I was forgetting the most important part, which is that tomorrow, here, we're going to have the first conference of SDSN. The Graduate School of Public Policy, on behalf of the Nazarbayev University, is hosting the SDSN. And last year, there was, in this very room, we had inauguration with the presence of President Shigeo Katsu and with the keynote speech of Jeffrey Sachs. This year, we're going to have the first conference, so please come back tomorrow. We will be starting at 9 o'clock. And so it will be equally, if not more, interesting. Thank you all.
But Lula told us